The briefing room.
Take that rifle away from her. I'm giving you a direct order.
Lieutenant Preston Sterling stood at the front of the briefing room, his face flushed and his voice hard. He was pointing straight at Staff Sergeant Harper Vance, like she was a problem that needed to be eradicated from the building. Not an enemy, not a threat. One of his own soldiers. He snatched the roster off the table and slammed it down in front of the senior NCO.
Who authorized this? Who put a woman in my marksman slot?
Nobody answered. Nobody moved.
Weeks later, that same woman would fire a single bullet across 1,840 meters of open Afghan sky and bring every single man in that room home alive. Staff Sergeant Harper Vance had been in the Army long enough to know when a room didn't want her in it. She could feel it the exact same way she could feel a shift in wind direction, not by looking, but through something quieter, something closer to pure instinct. A slight stiffening in body language, eyes that darted away a fraction too fast, a pause that lingered one beat too long before someone answered her question.
She had learned to read those heavy silences the way other soldiers read topographical maps, carefully, precisely, and entirely without emotion.
The briefing room at Fort Liberty was no different. It was the stifling peak of summer, and the air conditioning had been dead for 3 days. 16 soldiers sat in rigid plastic chairs arranged in 2 rows, their combat boots leaving smudges of red clay on the concrete floor. Some were murmuring, others were meticulously cleaning gear. A few possessed the privately admirable skill of sleeping with their eyes half open. Harper was sitting in the second row, 3rd seat from the left, when Lieutenant Preston Sterling walked in. He was young, fresh out of officer candidate school. His uniform was so impeccably pressed it looked practically unworn, a byproduct of him ironing it a second time that very morning. He carried a clipboard, holding it just a degree higher than necessary, as if the plastic board itself were a rank insignia. He stood at the front of the room, scanning their faces. Then his eyes dropped to the roster. The room had been mid-conversation, filled with the low, steady hum of soldiers killing time. But the atmosphere fractured the moment he stopped moving. The sound didn't die immediately. It faded, the way noise dissipates when a crowd senses a shift, but hasn't yet identified the danger. Sterling looked up from the clipboard. He swept his gaze across the room with agonizing slowness, and then his eyes locked onto Harper. She met his gaze, her expression completely unreadable. He looked back down at the paper. Then he said it.
Who gave her a rifle?
6 words. Delivered in the exact mundane tone someone might use to ask who left the coffee pot on.
The room went dead quiet. The specific, suffocating quiet that follows the pulling of a grenade pin, lingering in the breathless second before anyone decides whether to run. Harper did not flinch. She kept her eyes fixed forward, her hands resting lightly on her knees, remained entirely motionless. 12 years of military discipline had taught her that the absolute most powerful thing she could do in that moment was nothing. Because any alternative, a sharp intake of breath, a sideways glance, a tightened jaw would hand a man like Preston Sterling exactly what he was looking for. Proof that he had gotten to her.
Sergeant First Class Clayton Briggs, sitting directly to her left, cleared his throat. Briggs was a seasoned veteran. He had survived 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. His face bore the settled, heavily weathered landscape of a man who had long ago forgotten how to be surprised by anything. He was the human barometer of the unit, the soldier the younger guys instinctively looked to before deciding how to react. He looked at Sterling with an expression so devastatingly flat it almost passed for polite.
She came with the unit, sir, he said. Same as the rest of us.
Sterling flicked his eyes to Briggs, then back to Harper. I'm aware of how assignments work, Sergeant. That wasn't what I asked.
Then I'm not sure I understand the question, sir.
Another pause.
heavier this time. Sterling set the clipboard down on the small folding table and crossed his arms. "What I'm asking," he said, drawing out the words as if addressing a slow child, "is what her designated role is and why she's carrying a rifle built for long-range engagements." "Because she's the designated marksman, sir. I can read the roster." "Then you have your answer, sir." The silence that followed had a distinct physical weight. Harper had lived inside silences like that before. She knew precisely what they cost. She knew that Briggs had just spent a considerable sum of his social capital within the unit to defend her, and he had done it without looking at her once. That, in itself, was a profound kind of grace. Looking at her would have made the moment about her, and Briggs was smart enough to know that wasn't what the situation demanded. Sterling uncrossed his arms and picked up the clipboard. "Right," he muttered. "Let's get started." He offered no apology. He didn't acknowledge the gravity of what he'd said. He simply plowed forward, the way people do when they've unilaterally decided their words aren't actually a problem. Harper exhaled quietly and turned her full attention to the briefing. She had survived far worse than Preston Sterling, but she carefully took the moment and filed it away in a specific dark corner of her mind, where it would wait until it became relevant. She had a gut feeling it would be relevant again very soon. The genesis of the math. Harper Vance had been raised in a household where the word can't was treated with the same severe distaste as profanity technically existing in the world, theoretically understood, but absolutely forbidden at the dinner table. Her mother, Master Sergeant Lorraine Vance, had retired from the Army after 22 years in military intelligence, carrying herself with a posture so rigidly upright it looked like a personal moral policy. Her father, Arthur Vance, had dedicated 3 decades as an electrical systems contractor on military installations across 4 states. Together, they had raised Harper and her younger brother Nolan in a structured, fiercely loving, deeply disciplined silence that outsiders might have found claustrophobic. Harper, however, had always found it beautifully clarifying. Discipline was how her family communicated love. Precision was their language of care. Showing up being exactly where you promised to be and doing the work without complaint or excuse, that was the highest form of respect they knew how to offer. By the time she was 10, Harper could field strip a rifle faster than most grown men on the base. By 12, she was consistently outscoring seasoned veterans at the local shooting range outside Killeen, Texas. She shot with a quiet, terrifyingly methodical accuracy that made other shooters stop watch and then feel vaguely embarrassed for staring. She wasn't showing off. She was just shooting. Her father would stand directly behind her, arms crossed, his face locked in the subtle configuration that in the Vance household meant overflowing pride, eyes slightly narrowed, the faintest compression at the corner of his mouth. It was a face completely unreadable to anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime studying it. "Again," he would say. And she would shoot again. By 14, she was devouring manuals on ballistics, wind drift compensation, and the brutal physics of long-range precision fire. She read them the way other teenagers read fantasy novels, utterly absorbed, making meticulous notes in the margins in her neat, tiny handwriting. One evening, when Harper was 16, her mother sat her down and asked directly what she wanted to do with her life. Harper thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. "I want to be infantry," she said. Her mother fell silent. It wasn't the silence of someone caught off guard. It was the heavy, burdened silence of a mother carefully choosing how to deliver a devastating truth. "You can't," Lorraine finally said. "Not yet. Maybe not for a very long time. The Army doesn't allow women in infantry combat roles." Harper looked at her unblinking. "Then I'll find another way in." Her mother nodded once. "That," she said, "is the right answer." Harper enlisted the day after her 18th birthday. She went in as an intelligence analyst,
her mother's domain, and possessed such an overwhelming aptitude for it that she found the work almost insulting. She could breeze through complex analyses using only a fraction of her attention, leaving the rest of her mind entirely elsewhere. She was thorough, flawless, and blindingly fast. Her supervisors adored her, while Harper privately found the job about as fulfilling as solving math equations she had already memorized. The rifle, however, was different. The rifle demanded every single piece of her soul. It required every variable, every ruthless calculation, every fraction of a degree and millisecond of time. Wind speed, wind direction, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, elevation, distance to target, bullet grain, barrel twist rate, the exact angle of her body against the earth, the rhythm of her breathing, the razor-thin moment of suspended animation between heartbeats when she would squeeze the trigger. Not pull, never pull. Squeeze it like releasing a captive bird into the sky. She cross-trained in marksmanship at every conceivable opportunity. She applied for designated marksman training, was rejected, and applied again. When she was rejected a second time, she marched into her battalion commander's office and made her case in clear, hyper-specific technical language, arguing the way her mother had taught her, never with emotion, never with grievance, only with undeniable evidence. She got in on her third attempt. She graduated at the absolute top of her class. And then she did something almost no woman had managed at that stage of the war. She quietly, without a single grand announcement, worked herself into a position attached to front-line infantry patrols. It didn't happen by accident. It happened through grueling patience, flawless performance, and a reputation built so slowly and consistently that by the time anyone thought to question her presence, she was already an immovable fact on the ground. She wasn't just good for a woman. She wasn't just good for an intel analyst. She was purely, terrifyingly good. The kind of good that became a baseline assumption until Preston Sterling walked into a room with a clipboard and threw it all into question. The weight of the wind. During her first week under Sterling's command, Harper did what she always did when the terrain shifted. She observed. She watched how he ran his briefings. She gave him credit for efficiency. His intelligence was current, his orders were lucid, and he abhorred wasted time. But he also had a habit of talking over people. Not loudly, not even maliciously, just cutting in a fraction of a second before they finished speaking, as if he had already deduced their point and decided his response was infinitely more valuable. It was the conversational equivalent of cutting someone off in traffic while strictly adhering to the speed limit. Technically within bounds, but deeply problematic. She watched how he engaged with the men. With Briggs, who radiated the kind of quiet, lethal authority that made junior officers sweat, Sterling was deeply respectful. With the younger enlisted guys, he was collegial in a highly practiced, artificial way. He was constantly assessing the room, building and rebuilding an internal hierarchy. And when he looked at Harper, the math in his head simply refused to add up. She could feel it in the microscopic hesitation before he addressed anything in her general vicinity. She saw it when the after-action reports came back featuring her exact language, but conspicuously missing her name. She heard it in the way he exclusively referred to her as the designated marksman. Never Sergeant Vance. Never Vance. Not even Harper. Just a function. A piece of government-issued hardware that inconveniently happened to be breathing. She mentioned it to Briggs one evening as they sat in comfortable, companionable silence, cleaning their weapons. "He calls me the designated marksman," she said softly, stating it like a shift in the weather. "In every report, every debrief." Briggs didn't look up from his rifle right away. "I noticed. Does it bother you?" Briggs slowly set down his cleaning rod and gave her his heavy, measured attention. "It bothers me,"
he rumbled, that he actually thinks he's being subtle.
Harper almost smiled. What's his problem? Do you think, I mean, the actual source of it? Briggs picked the rod back up, turning the metal over in his calloused hands. He's not a terrible officer, he said thoughtfully. He's competent. He'll make captain easily. But he comes from a rigid world where certain things belong in certain boxes. When they don't fit, he genuinely doesn't know where to put them, so he just pretends the anomalous thing isn't there. It's easier than rearranging all the furniture in his head. Harper looked down at her barrel, watching the gunmetal catch the fading light. That is a shockingly generous interpretation, she murmured. I'm a generous man. Is that what we're calling it? She shot him a sideways glance, and the crinkle around his eyes was close enough to a smile that she counted it. They fell back into silence, but Harper chewed on his words. Pretending the thing that doesn't fit isn't there. She understood the impulse. The world was vastly easier to navigate when it conformed to the shapes you were taught to expect. She had spent her entire life being a shape that flat out refused to fit. What she couldn't stomach, however, was how someone could watch her do the work flawlessly and still choose blindness. But she filed that thought away too, and kept doing the work. The calibration. The patrols leading into the fall were grinding and atmospheric. Combat was rarely the cinematic barrage civilians imagined. It was hours of agonizing, suffocating vigilance, punctuated by bursts of sheer terror. It was the endurance of being fiercely ready for something that could happen in the next heartbeat, or never happen at all. Harper excelled at the waiting. While the other soldiers rotated through mental hygiene, cracking jokes, telling stories, clinging to the small social rituals that tethered them to their humanity, Harper was constantly running the math. She analyzed the terrain, measuring distances with the naked eye and confirming them with her rangefinder. She cataloged the dust, the sway of the dry grass, the flutter of a fellow soldier's sleeve. She picked random points on the distant horizon and silently calculated the exact ballistics required to kill a target there. It wasn't paranoia, it was calibration. She kept the math agonizingly alive in her blood so that when the moment finally broke, she wouldn't have to think. She would just know. The way a lung knows how to draw air. Private First Class Mateo Garza, a 20-year-old kid from San Antonio who possessed more questions than any human being Harper had ever met, noticed her doing this one afternoon. "Sergeant Vance?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "What are you staring at?" "That ridge, northeast, 1,100 meters. Garza squinted. "There's nothing up there. Wind's coming out of the west at about 12 miles per hour, Harper said evenly. "The angle of the rock face creates a deflection corridor right here." She gestured to the empty air in front of them. "Makes it a perfect nest for anyone who wants to watch us without sharing our elevation." Garza swallowed hard. "Is there someone up there?" "No." "Then why are we talking about it?" "Because there might be tomorrow." Garza let that hang in the air. "That's deeply terrifying." "It's just math," she replied. "The terrifying part isn't the math, Sergeant. The terrifying part is that you are constantly running it, while the rest of us are just walking." "Someone has to be." He looked at her, his young face stripped of any sarcasm. "Do you ever turn it off?" Harper glanced sideways at him. There was something disarmingly genuine about Garza. He approached the world with an open curiosity that older soldiers had long since buried. "When I'm home," she answered truthfully. "What do you do at home? Read math textbooks?" A faint, ghostly smile touched her lips. "Sometimes." "Jesus." He shook his head, but grinned, dropping back into formation. Harper returned to the numbers. But later, long after everything had shattered and she was trying to piece together the shape of her life, she would remember that quiet conversation on an Afghan hillside. She would remember that Garza had seen her not as a rank, not as a gender, not as a shape that refused to fit,
but simply as a person.
The invisible threat. Days before the mission that would change everything, Sterling called a briefing. The objective was a reconnaissance patrol, a ridge survey of the Southern Valley approaches. 12 soldiers, full battle rattle, pre-dawn departure.
Higher command had flagged elevated movement patterns in the valley. It wasn't actionable intel, there was no specific target, but rather an ambient, creeping awareness that something was shifting in the dark.
Harper had already dissected the raw intelligence on her own time. She had cross-referenced the shadows on the satellite imagery against historical data and the topographical features she had spent weeks memorizing. Her conclusion was chillingly clear. The movement wasn't random. It was pre-positioning. Something heavy was being dragged into range. She raised her hand. Sterling suppressed a sigh. Sergeant Vance, the movement signatures in the south approach strongly suggest pre-positioning activities, sir. The intervals in geography are highly consistent with an enemy force establishing a direct or indirect fire support position.
The room went dead silent. Sterling stared at his impeccably organized notes. Brigade intelligence indicates general elevated activity.
Yes, sir. But I am suggesting the activity possesses a highly specific character. I recommend we identify likely mortar or crew-served weapon emplacements along our patrol route and build aggressive contingency plans.
Sterling let the pause stretch. It wasn't the silence of a commander weighing tactical advice. It was the irritated hesitation of a man deciding how to swat away an interruption.
We will adhere to standard patrol protocols, he said coldly. Designated marksman, confirm your equipment status. There it was. Designated marksman. Briggs shifted imperceptibly in the front row.
Harper locked eyes with Sterling.
Equipment is confirmed, sir, she said.
She didn't argue.
She had laid the truth on the table. What he did with it was out of her hands. But in that exact moment, she made a silent vow. Whatever monster was dragging itself into that valley, she was going to be ready for it. Because the math never lied, and the moment was coming whether Preston Sterling believed in it or not.
The night before the patrol, Harper sat alone in the cavernous equipment bay, running the numbers like a rosary. Distance, elevation, wind drift. She thought about Briggs saying, "He doesn't know where to put it." She thought about her mother telling her the army wouldn't let her fight. She thought about her father's silent pride.
She stripped her rifle and meticulously rebuilt it, leaving absolutely nothing to chance or luck. Then she closed her eyes. She didn't pray for safety, and she certainly didn't pray for glory. She prayed for clarity. The simple, brutal ability to see what was in front of her, do the math, and let the bullet fly at the exact right millisecond.
The ridge.
The morning of the patrol began like every bad day begins, perfectly mimicking a normal routine. Harper was fully kitted and running wind vectors in her head before the pre-dawn call even echoed over the radio.
Sterling briefed them sharply. Eyes only. Observe and report. No engagement unless fired upon. When Harper tried one last time to warn him that they might be walking into a fatal ambush, he shut her down with a brick wall of protocol. They marched into the dark. Garza stayed close to Harper's shoulder. "You really believe there's something down there?" he whispered.
"I believe the math," she replied. "What if you know and nobody listens? Then you make absolutely sure you're ready anyway. And you pray that being ready is enough."
They crested the ridge as the thin mountain air began to bite. Harper threw herself onto the rock face, settling her body into the dirt with the terrifying efficiency of a predator. She pressed her eye to the glass. The valley floor was 1,840 meters away, over a mile. And she saw it immediately. The disturbed earth she had warned them about. The jagged geometry of a heavy weapon emplacement. "Designated marksman to actual," she hissed into the radio. "I have visual confirmation of a crew-served weapon at bearing 247. Mortar tube. 3 personnel. They are in the preparation phase." Sterling's voice cracked back. "Acknowledge,"
Maintain observation only. Sir, they are setting up. They will be hot in approximately 4 to 6 minutes. Confirm tube classification. 82 millimeter, based on tube length and the staging of the rounds. Sir, we need a decision right now. Hold position. I am calling higher for guidance. Riggs cut into the net, his voice a low growl. If that tube goes hot while we wait on command, we are sitting ducks on an exposed rock. A ranging shot at this distance will kill someone. Hold your position, Sergeant. That is a direct order. Harper didn't blink. Through the glass, she watched the enemy commander shouting orders. She watched a fighter slam the heavy base plate into the dirt. She watched another pick up a mortar round. The commander looked up. He wasn't looking at them, but he was looking at the ridge. He knew the angles. Harper flipped to the intra-element channel. Briggs, they're setting the plate. 2 minutes. I know, Briggs replied, his voice terrifyingly calm. An agonizing minute bled away. The enemy fighter hoisted the mortar round over the lip of the tube. Harper's finger slid from the trigger guard to the metal curve of the trigger itself. She pulled oxygen through her nose, held it, and let it bleed out through her teeth. Find the still point. Sterling finally came back on the net. Higher is reviewing. Maintain observation. Sir, Briggs snapped. They are loading a live round right now. If we wait, we eat the first shell. Silence. The kind of silence where men die. Then, incredibly, Sterling spoke. Designated marksman. On target, Harper breathed. What is your confidence level? High. Distance is 1,840 meters. 4 agonizing seconds ticked past. Harper counted every single one. Can you make that shot? Sterling asked. Harper felt her heartbeat pulsing in her fingertips. She looked at the wind. She looked at the 47 meters of ballistic arc she would have to conquer. Yes, she said. No hesitation. No qualifiers. Just absolute certainty. Take the shot. Harper exhaled. She locked the crosshairs onto the enemy commander's chest. She found the sacred empty space between her heartbeats. She squeezed. The rifle roared a massive concussion of sound that was instantly swallowed by the vastness of the mountains. And then there was nothing. Because at 1,840 meters, the bullet takes 2.7 seconds to arrive. In normal life, 2.7 seconds is nothing. On a naked ridge in Afghanistan, watching an enemy fighter holding a live explosive above a steel tube, 2.7 seconds is an eternity. It is a lifetime compressed into a breath. 1. She did not blink. 2. 2.7. The enemy commander simply ceased to be. He didn't stumble. He collapsed instantly, his body dropping with the absolute finality of a machine that has been abruptly unplugged. The fighter holding the shell froze, stared in horror at the ridge, and sprinted for his life. The third man was already running. The radio net erupted into beautiful, chaotic life.
Target down, Briggs roared. Garza was screaming over an open channel.
Oh my God, she hit it! Did you see that? Harper ignored the noise. She smoothly swept the valley floor, hunting for secondary threats, scanning every shadow. The valley was entirely clear. She finally pulled her eye away from the scope. Her hands were completely steady. Briggs materialized beside her, breathing hard. He stared down into the abyss. 1,840 meters, he whispered. Confirmed, she said. Briggs looked at her, his weathered face cracked open with raw awe. I have been in this army for 21 years. I have never seen anything like that in my entire life. Harper just nodded. The aftermath and the record. They survived the march back. The crushing weight of the anticipated ambush had vanished, replaced by the dizzying, complicated euphoria of cheating death. Garza walked behind her, practically vibrating. Thank you, he stammered. How do you feel? Like the math worked, she replied evenly. Is that enough? Today it is. When they crossed back into the wire, the base felt different. The air was thick with a watching silence. Word had traveled at the speed of light. Soldiers stood at the edges of the staging area, tracking Harper with a newfound reverent intensity. She ignored them all, marching straight to the armory to break down her weapon. She was deep in the methodical rhythm of cleaning the bolt when Sterling walked in. He didn't wear his usual mask of arrogance. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire worldview shatter and hadn't yet figured out how to sweep up the glass. "Sergeant Vance," he said softly. She looked up. "That shot," he murmured. "That was exceptional marksmanship. You made the right call." "Thank you, sir," she said. She held his gaze. "The intelligence assessment regarding the pre-positioning. I'm telling you this so the next time a pattern emerges, it gets evaluated properly." Sterling stood there for a long time. When he finally looked at her, he wasn't looking at a function. He was looking at a human being. "Noted," he said, and walked out. Harper sat alone in the armory and finally let the adrenaline crash over her. 12 soldiers walking home, a bullet flying for nearly 3 seconds. She closed her eyes and felt a profound, exhausting wave of pure relief. But the victory was short-lived. The next morning, Specialist Wyatt Lynn found her at the shooting range, his face tight with anger. He had been working in the operations center when the battalion command reviewed Sterling's after-action report. "He wrote an 11-page report," Lynn said, his voice trembling with indignation. "He mentioned the designated marksman 14 times. He didn't use your name once, Harper. Not once." Harper stared at the paper target downrange. 14 times. He had intentionally scrubbed her from her own miracle. "Major Vargas caught it," Lynn continued eagerly. "She pulled the radio transcripts. She ripped him apart in her office. She told him your name goes in the permanent record and it is non-negotiable." Harper didn't feel rage. She felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, followed by the quiet, radiant warmth of finally being seen. Not paraded, just acknowledged as real. By midday, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Thorne had summoned Sterling Briggs and Harper into his office. Thorne was a titan of a man with 3 decades of combat experience. He didn't waste time. He made Sterling recount the timeline. He made Harper walk him through the insane ballistics of the shot. "The manual says that rifle maxes out at 800 meters, Thorne said, leaning over his desk. "There is no doctrine for what you did." "The physics accounts for it, sir," Harper replied flawlessly. "The manual just hasn't caught up." Thorne stared at her, deeply moved. "I am submitting you for a Bronze Star with Valor, and the amended report will stand. Your name. Your shot. It's a correction of a profound error." When they stepped out into the hallway, Briggs looked at her. "Your name in the permanent record." "Like it should have been from the start," she said. "The shadow box." Weeks later, the medal was approved. The battalion stood in rigid formation under the blinding Afghan sun to hear the citation read aloud. When Thorne pinned the heavy medal to her chest, he leaned in. "The Army is better because you are in it, Sergeant Vance. I'm sorry it took us this long to put it in writing." After the formation, Sterling approached her. He looked exhausted but genuine. "I asked them to include a special addendum about your intelligence work before the patrol," he confessed. "I wanted the record to show the math you did when no one was looking. I know it doesn't fix what I originally wrote." Harper looked at the man who had tried to erase her. "No, it doesn't. But thank you." When the deployment finally ended, she flew home in the dead of night. Her parents were waiting at the gate in Texas. Her father, a man forged from stoicism and calluses, took one look at his daughter, wrapped his arms around her, and wept into her shoulder. When they got back to the house, there was a handcrafted shadow box sitting on the kitchen table. Her father had built it with agonizing precision. Inside sat a replica of her Bronze Star, the polished brass casing of the bullet she had fired,
and a pristine copy of the official amended military report.
Every single place her name appeared on the page, Staff Sergeant Harper Vance, her father, had meticulously highlighted in brilliant yellow ink.
"So you can see every place it is?" her father choked out.
"Every place it belongs." Harper ran her fingers over the glass, staring at the bright yellow proof of her existence, and finally felt the war end. Passing the math. Forward years passed. Harper quietly left the military and took a brilliant civilian analytical job. She lived a quiet, hyper-organized life. She didn't give interviews. She didn't bask in glory. But one evening her phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Is this Staff Sergeant Harper Vance?" a young, nervous female voice asked. "Who's calling?" "My name is Private First Class Sarah Desai. I'm a designated marksman trainee at Fort Campbell. Sergeant Briggs gave me your number. I read the citation from your deployment. I just needed to call you." Harper sat at her kitchen table. She looked across the room at the wooden shadow box gleaming in the ambient light. She thought about the briefing room. She thought about the 2.7 seconds of flight time. She thought about the crushing weight of being erased and the magnificent salvation of being written back into the world. "Okay, Zara," Harper said softly, pulling a yellow legal pad toward her. "Start with the math." The math. Every miraculous shot starts with the math. Most people just want to pull the trigger. That's why they fail when it counts. Harper smiled into the phone. "Tell me the math." And that was the true end of the story. Not a piece of metal in a box, but a woman sitting at a kitchen table, passing the fire forward to a young girl who desperately needed to know that the rule book was never the limit. The math was the limit, and Harper Vance was always willing to teach it.